Dr. Cooper, why do we need to be aware of the fat that's in our bloodstream?
Well, that fat in our bloodstream could determine whether or not we're at risk for vascular conditions. That would include heart attack,
Death.
strokes.
Death. All death. To me, it's all death.
Not necessarily.
But the good news is we actually can control a number of these fats.
Yeah, we can control a lot of the variables, but there are some that we really have a harder time controlling.
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. Great to see you two.
Hi there.
Hey. So on the show this week, we're going to be talking about the fat that lives in your bloodstream. All of us have it. And just today, I can't believe I'm embarrassed to admit this, I've heard the phrase HDL, LDL when we talk about cholesterol, but I had no idea that the final L was lipoprotein. So
Yes.
we're talking about high-density lipoproteins, low-density lipoproteins.
Right.
And on TV now, I'm seeing ads about lipoprotein A, which is another type of lipoprotein. So Dr. Cooper, let's set the baseline. What is lipoprotein and why should we be concerned about it?
Well, lipoprotein is an element of fat, as we've talked about. And don't ask me how all of it is formed in the liver because it is a very complex sequence of reactions. But most of our cholesterol is produced in the liver, and it goes through a series of reactions that then ends up as various different types of lipoproteins. And those circulate in our bloodstream. And they can, if they get to be too elevated, they can lead to increased risk for cardiovascular disease is the primary concern.
Wow. So let's break down the types. So we've heard the phrase good cholesterol. We've heard the phrase bad cholesterol. Let's talk about those first, and then we'll get to lipoprotein A after that.
Mm-hmm. So, over the years, we've been told we have the total cholesterol, and within that, we have good and bad cholesterol. And the good was referring to HDL, high density lipoprotein. Over the years, a lot of studies were done that showed that the beneficial effects of high density lipoprotein are not as marked as they've been described previously. But HDL does have some beneficial impact, definitely, because it helps prevent the damage that can occur from the LDL, the low density lipoprotein. So it is beneficial to have a good amount of the HDL, but maybe not as beneficial as they used to think. It doesn't really protect you. A lot of people think, well, I'm fine just because I have a high HDL number. And so they think that cancels out all the negative effects of having a high LDL, low density lipoprotein number, and that's not really true. But the high density is not thought to be detrimental to our health. There are some exceptions to that, though. With extreme levels, it can be. But the low density, the LDL, is nicknamed the bad cholesterol. And that definitely is the portion of the cholesterol that we have to watch out for, because if it gets to be too high, it can lead to plaque formation in our arteries.
So it's kind of like floating around in your bloodstream, and it's kind of squishy and low density. And so that can get stuck on like the artery wall and then turn into plaque eventually?
Yes, that's kind of how it works. Usually the first thing that happens is inflammation, a certain amount of inflammation in the vascular walls. And once there's a little bit of inflammation there, it's easier for things to stick to that area because it's rough and it kind of catches stuff. And so the LDL, the low density lipoprotein, comes in various forms actually. And there's certain forms of the LDL that are stickier and have an easier time sticking to those areas of inflammation and starting to build up what we call plaque or thrombus, which is a foamy material that starts to develop that can turn into a lot of plaque formation that starts out as soft, but then over time ends up with more of a calcified type of plaque that's hard. So the concern is that plaque in the arteries can break off and then go downstream and obstruct the blood flow to your heart muscle. And so then your heart muscle can't get any oxygen and can't get any fuel. And then that leads to basically a heart attack. The other problem would be it could break off and it could float through your system and obstruct something in your brain blood flow and cause a stroke. And so the most common heart attacks and strokes are caused by this type of thing, ischemic. It's called ischemic.
So let's talk about when you get these tests, you get all these numbers back and you're looking at the numbers and you go, is this a good number? Is it a bad number? You know, they have all the charts, but you never really know what everything means. And then people like me, they're all like, oh, you have great cholesterol, you have great cholesterol, but then I have this one number that's disaster. So what do they all mean?
Well, in the general population, we normally see a standard test, which is total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, triglycerides. That makes up the basic, what's called a lipid panel.
Right.
And most people do get that test run. And so that's really limited amount of information there. So it's hard to really judge the risk from just those numbers, honestly. But in general, the cholesterol, total cholesterol should be below 200 for adults, below 170 for young people. And the LDL cholesterol should be below 100, essentially for adults, and below 110 for kids. And then there's the triglycerides, which for adults should be below 150, and for kids it should be below 90. So we look at those numbers and try to say you're at this risk or you're that risk. But the problem is, we talked
Can we back up for just a second?
Yeah.
I'm taking notes as I always do.
Okay.
HDL. What's a good HDL number?
Yes, HDL. So in men, 40 or higher is considered okay. For women, it's like 50 or higher.
Okay.
Generally, you could go with 45 for both.
And then the triglyceride number should be what?
Under 150 for adults and under 90 for kids.
Wow. Okay, that's crazy.
Yeah. And so, one of the problems is that we look at LDL, and LDL comes in various forms. So not all LDL is damaging. And so when we only have that general panel, we don't really know, because you may have an elevated LDL and it might not be as risky, or you might have an LDL that looks okay, but because you don't know the other risk levels of other particle counts or that lipoprotein A level that we talked about, because you don't know those, you don't know if you really are low risk or not. So it's better to get an advanced panel.
That's interesting. And you've told us before that you don't want to have levels that are too low because cholesterol is really important. I mean, isn't your brain like half fat? And so having some of these fats is really important for cell development, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, ideally, our cell membranes are made from fats that are more from what are called monounsaturated, which we get from plants and things like that. But hormones really use cholesterol as a building block. And so if we suppress it too much, it could theoretically impair some of our other hormone production capacity. So the idea isn't to reduce the cholesterol way down to zero or anything like that, but just, again, to know your numbers to the extent of knowing all the detail that could give you the target ranges that you really need to achieve for all the various elements, and then try to go after those and get them into the range that they should be.
And then there's things like particle size A, is it? Particle size be? And then we know the size, and there's big ones and fattier ones and
The big,
littler
big
chunks,
fluffy ones too, right?
fluffy. Yeah.
So
Like, I know I have ones that they're not supposed to be or something. I don't know. I know you in danger, girl, as they say.
Well, the main thing to do is find that expanded panel. And so that
Right.
could be, there's different types out there, and your doctor could easily order those. Quest Lab does something called the Cardio IQ test, which breaks it down further into all those particles, the LDL particles, and the other risk markers. Then LabCorp does something called the NMR lipoprofile. And various other labs, the Berkeley lab does testing, Cleveland Clinic does testing. There's something called the VAP panel. There's a lot of these panels, but what you want to really look for is a test that breaks down the type of LDL into small, dense LDL particles versus the total particle counts, basically to determine the size of the particles, either the average size or the peak size of the particles. So there's a lot more information you can get on LDL. So what we want to get is what is the average size or the peak size of your LDL? If it's large, that's beneficial because the large LDL particles don't tend to trigger the plaque formation as much. They tend to float around, they're more buoyant, and they don't stick as much to the artery walls. The smaller they are, the worse it is because those small ones are dense and sticky.
And
And
tricky. Sticky
yes,
and tricky.
and they contribute far more to plaque formation. So, first understanding what size are my LDL particles. And then these tests can tell you how many particles you have. Because again, the fewer particles you have, the better. And the larger they are, the better. So, that would be what you want to see for the LDL. And then there are additional risk markers to check. So lipoprotein A is referred to as LPA, LPA or LP little a, people call it. And that happens to be a very kind of potentially dangerous marker in the lipid panel, the advanced lipid panel. It represents a form of LDL that is particularly atherogenic, which means promotes plaque formation. So having an elevated level of that could increase your risk for plaque formation by up to 40%. So if you have a person that has that elevation, then it's kind of like, oh, red alert. That means that our targets for our LDL levels and our cholesterol and things like that should be much lower than someone who does not have that marker. And it's good to remember that that marker, it's genetically determined. So it's 90% based on our genetics. And unfortunately, it's one of the things that is not what's called modifiable. So it's a risk factor that is not modifiable. That means that exercise, your nutrition are not going to impact it. You can take perfect care of yourself and it will be elevated because of that genetic predisposition that is not modifiable. When you look at other things like your LDL particle counts, your LDL level, that is modifiable because there are medications that work well to reduce those. Our dietary patterns, our exercise can impact those. But when it comes to the lipoprotein A or LP little a, it's not really modifiable based on that. And medications to treat it have limited effect. You know, there are some medications that can address it, but it's got limited effect. And there are other ways to address it, and upcoming treatments too in the pipeline. But right now, it's harder to get after that one. But there's another marker called apolipoprotein B, and that also is something that promotes more plaque formation. The good thing about apolipoprotein B is it is also modifiable. So with improvements in metabolism, the apolipoprotein B usually improves quite a bit if it were elevated. But apolipoprotein B can also trigger more plaque formation. So the one that's the most concerning is the lipoprotein A, though.
And it sounds like we've got a ways to go before we fully understand how to control that, huh?
Yes. Right now, there's a group of medicines used for controlling cholesterol, controlling LDL, called PCSK1 inhibitors. And PCSK1 inhibitors are shown to reduce lipoprotein A, but only by about 15%. So it's not dramatic. And the main effect of the PCSK1 inhibitors is to control the LDL and the LDL particles. But the one downside of the PCSK1 inhibitors is insurance doesn't cover them very easily unless you've already had a heart attack.
That's
Don't you
nice.
just don't you just love insurance companies? It's like going to a car repair shop. Don't come in unless something like catastrophic
Unless your
breaks.
car blew up, we can't handle you.
We wouldn't want to prevent anything.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm laughing so that I don't cry.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing is they are associated with a pretty strong increased risk of elevated blood sugar levels, like
Oh, good.
prediabetes, diabetes. So that's a problem. But there are a lot of drugs in development now that they're showing great promise in this area. With eventually, we'll have the ability to lower the lipoprotein A by like 80 or 90% with these.
Will we be alive to see them?
Yes,
That's the important
yes, we will.
question.
I think they'll be within the next 5 years. We'll be seeing
Oh,
something.
I might be alive.
In extreme cases where it's extremely high, there's even something called apheresis, which is done to literally like filter your blood, to remove it from your blood. And that would be something that you'd have to do like every couple of weeks. And it's a big, extensive
Oh,
process.
that doesn't sound fun.
Yeah, not fun.
That
but
sounds really not
but
good.
it is important to know these numbers for sure, because otherwise, how do you really determine whether
Right.
you're at risk or not? And
Like,
remember,
I know I'm at risk. And then I had the test, and then they said that I wiggled too much. So it wasn't totally reliable, but they still knew that it was not good. They're like,
I don't even know
well,
what does that mean. You
I was,
wiggled
isn't that what it said, Dr. Cooper? I wiggled. What did it say?
well, yes, because you have that, as you've shared with the audience, you've had that you have the lipoprotein.
I have it. I
Right.
have it. I
You
have the
risk
problem.
marker. And so we were trying to get a more advanced heart scan. So again, when you see these tests, so you see the advanced lipid panel, and if you're a person that scores in those high risk categories, of course you should have a calcium scoring heart scan. In Andrea's case, we did the more advanced one where it shows not just the hard plaque, but soft plaque also. And yes,
So they looked at my heart. You know, it was one of the, what do
Yeah.
you call it?
a coronary artery, a CT angiogram
yeah.
for your coronary arteries. Yeah.
You go in the donut.
Yeah. But, they tried to blame Andrea for wiggling, but
But why didn't they tell me I was wiggling?
I don't think you really were wiggling. I think they just didn't get good images and they were trying to blame the patient.
Oh, gosh.
blame the patient.
Yeah.
But that lipoprotein A really has been associated with higher levels of calcium deposits, right, in the heart.
Yes, it is. And, keep in mind, heart disease is the number one killer for women.
Men and women.
Yes, men and women. And
They used to say only men, but it's women too.
yeah, and so knowing all these numbers and where you are, so the difference would be because the lipoprotein A, it really does increase that risk. And so your lifestyle, you may feel like, oh, it's hopeless because it's genetic and it's not modifiable. But that's not really true because your lifestyle is all you have to make the difference. Your lifestyle and any medications to control the LDL cholesterol and your metabolism, to make sure your metabolism is really strong. So strengthening the metabolism if there are metabolic dysfunction elements in there, and controlling the LDL cholesterol with medication. And people are very anti-statin these days, but you really need to think about statins because it's
Right.
our best way to bring that LDL down to an acceptable range. For example, if you don't have elevated lipoprotein A, we said the targets for LDL are under 100 with good particle counts, like looking and seeing that your particles are where they should be. But if you have elevated LPA, depending on how high it is, we might want to get your LDL down to 40 or under.
Right. And mine are all really my other numbers are all really good. Mm-hmm. So normally a doctor would, if they only looked at that, they would say, oh, she's fine.
Right. They would say that. But you wouldn't look as good. I mean, you need to take statins to
Yes,
get
I
these
do.
numbers down. And one of the problems with the statins to think about is that they do tend to increase the
Elevate.
lipoprotein A just a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
not dramatically, but a little bit. But the benefits outweigh that risk because they also reduce the LDL, the damaging part that really triggers the plaque formation. So they're still very beneficial, but there are some concerns with the statins too, because they also have been associated with increasing glucose. And so that needs to be monitored as well.
What I'd love to do right now is transition to what we can control through what we eat. Because, Dr. Cooper, you've said for a long time, hey, Mark, try adding a few more avocados
Legumes.
to your diet.
Always legumes.
And when we start talking about monosaturated fats, there are so many benefits, right? Heart
Yeah.
health. They lower the LDL, they increase the HDL, they can enhance insulin sensitivity, improve blood sugar. Talk about what foods we should be gravitating toward and what some of those benefits might be.
When you think about it, when it comes to just our food, what is beneficial for our metabolism is usually beneficial for our LDL too. And so, looking at our foods, if we think about the fats, the more we get that comes from plants, the better. And, people right now are very anti seeds. You know,
Oh,
I
they
don't know if
are?
you've heard that. Yeah, the seed oil is the new villain. But the seed oils are very good for us, actually. And we'll probably get some mail for this because it is in popular thinking that somehow, I don't know how this got into the mainstream, but people are very concerned about seed oils now. But actually, seeds like sunflower seeds, sesame seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds are actually good. They tend to have some of them have omega-3 oils. They actually have a lot of health benefits and they're not detrimental to us, which is kind of what's circulating, but it's not really true. But the different oils all have different place in our health. And so when you look at plant oils, you can't really go wrong. But if you could concentrate some of the fats on those monounsaturated, that is really beneficial health wise. So that would be like avocados, macadamia nuts, olive oil. And so really focusing on those and including those in the diet is important. But the other area that's really interesting is resistant starches are very beneficial too. And they're very good for our LDL cholesterol as well as soluble fiber is good too.
What is a resistant starch?
What's a resistant starch?
One that doesn't want to get eaten?
Yeah, I'm like, wait, who's resisting starches? I don't know. Those are my ones that I think those are things I like.
Yeah. Well, it's really fascinating. Like resistant starch is a form of starch that you actually, it has to do with how you prepare food a lot of times, how food is prepared. Not just how you cook it, but how it's manufactured as well. So it's really interesting. So if you think about resistant starch, why it's beneficial is when we digest it, it really improves our microbiome. And it also improves our gut hormone production, to be more anti-diabetic, anti-obesity, anti-cardiovascular disease. So it has a lot of beneficial effects once we ingest it. But what it is foods, like say you cook potatoes or pasta, if you let it cool, and once it cools, you can do anything you want with it. You can reheat it or you can eat it cold, but the cooling process changes the chemical composition of the starch and converts it to a resistant starch. So it's actually has more health benefits just
Then
by
eating
doing
it warm?
Yes. Well, you can eat it warm, but you should, after you cook it, cool it. So, like cooking in batches is good for that kind of thing. Make your grains, make your potatoes, make your pasta in batches, and then eat it left over, freeze it or whatever. But
Like if
as
you
long,
put like cold quinoa in a salad or something like that?
yeah. When you cool the starch, it changes the composition and makes it into this resistant starch. And that holds even if you reheat it. So that adds benefit to it. The other interesting thing is, like for pastas, how they're manufactured. So the ones that have ridges are more resistant starch.
Oh, isn't that funny?
Yes. And so, like rigatoni or something. So, anything with the ridges tends to be more of a resistant starch. And when you come to things like cereals, that extrusion method of production where it's forced through like these little holes,
Yeah.
like pasta is. I mean, all of pasta is like that. So pasta is kind of resistant in general, but the more ridges, the more resistant it is. But with cereals, something that is produced by pushing it through, so like the flakes are considered more resistant as well. So it's kind of weird. It's in the food manufacturing, the food preparation, that it converts the starch to this resistant form that has more benefit. But then also things with soluble fiber are very beneficial, barley and oats. So, so the reason for all that, they're not exactly sure, but they have seen in the research that it improves the hormone profile, the metabolic hormone profile associated with eating, and improves our microbiome health and our ability to reduce like cardiovascular risk because of that, and diabetes risk, obesity risk. So that's an area that you can do something about. But food isn't the only area, that could improve the LDL and the LDL particles. But that's one of the main areas to look at. But it doesn't mean that people who eat like perfectly healthy, don't eat a lot of animal proteins, and have these like plant forward diets, doesn't mean that they are going to see a benefit from it. It's worth a try, but not everybody's body responds to that. So it's worth a try, but don't be disappointed if it didn't make a difference, because for a lot of people that we see, it doesn't. I mean, it's giving you other health benefits, but it may not be enough to regulate that LDL.
That's really interesting. That's the first I've ever heard of that, Dr. Cooper. And I used several different AI bots, and I just looked up on that. What an interesting concept that it resists digestion in the small intestine.
Yeah.
And so that it doesn't extract as much of the glucose, and it goes into the large intestine where it's fermented by gut bacteria. And what an interesting thing. It even says like unripe bananas are resistant starch. That's crazy.
Yeah,
Wow.
eating your banana is not quite as ripe. Exactly. It is interesting. But then, getting outside of the food part, exercise is also beneficial for LDL cholesterol. And that's pretty much every kind of physical activity can help reduce the LDL cholesterol. I would definitely make sure if you have the lipoprotein A elevation that you're daily, not daily, but I mean, in your regular life, that you have an active lifestyle and that you incorporate some kind of challenging exercise in there where you can, because that also does improve your heart health. It improves the strength of your heart to help combat if something were to go wrong with a plaque dislodging, but it also helps reduce the overall cardiovascular risk. The other things that we've talked about before are still important for heart health, like sleep apnea is, again, we keep talking about it, but it's really detrimental to cardiovascular disease risk. And so definitely getting the sleep apnea under control is critical as well.
Well, speaking of exercise, I have a challenge for Andrea.
Uh-oh.
You live in a building that has an exercise room.
Yes.
Which
I've
is,
seen it.
Steps away from your door.
Yes, I've seen it.
I joined a health club about a year ago, and I think I've gone 3 times in a year.
I know.
So before next week,
I have to go visit it.
you have to go once, and I have to go once.
All
And
right.
they also offer yoga classes at this gym that I signed up for and went to 3 times.
So you have to go there for more than a smoothie.
Yeah. Okay, so do you accept the challenge?
Yeah, I really am gonna go and see the little gym.
Okay, even if it's just to walk for 20 minutes gently on the treadmill.
Yeah.
Or
I'll
as
do
you
the
called
bike.
it, that walkie thing.
The walkie thing, or the bike. I do the bike.
That's less impact. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like it. Well, this has been really an interesting conversation. Who knew that the fats in our blood played such a key role to our overall health, both good and bad outcomes based on, I mean, we've got French fry fat and then we've got
I know.
olive oil.
I know.
There's
The
quite a
avocado
difference.
thing. The avocado thing. I mean,
Isn't that crazy?
It's so interesting because it's really not that hard to eat avocados right now. I mean,
Yeah.
it may get more difficult, but they're so good.
Yeah.
And it really isn't that hard to switch to cooking in olive oil, or avocado oil is less expensive now than it used to be. And it's really tasty. Um, and using your air fryer, if you have one, for things is really convenient for different things. I find it very convenient, but
It all adds up, doesn't it?
it really does add up.
Well, and one thing I'd probably mention that we didn't talk about as a risk factor that you could monitor on your blood work is that TMAO level, which remember that is we've talked about it in other episodes, but it's a byproduct of unhealthy microbiome in your body. And
Oh,
it's
is that the one that we just did?
we
for
just
me?
did for you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
mine was elevated. Ew.
Yeah, and it was surprising because you do consume a lot of the foods that help it, like the produce and whole grains, beans, stuff like that. But you were on medication that affects your microbiome. Remember?
Yeah, the acid suppressing
Acid suppressing medication.
drugs.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so the reflux type medications, they really can alter our microbiome
Ooh, I
significantly.
didn't know that.
Yes, and so can artificial sweeteners and things. But if you have what's called dysbiosis, which is like an unhealthy flora situation in your gut or throughout your body, the microbiome is not as healthy, then it gives off this byproduct TMAO. And TMAO has been associated with an increase in cardiovascular risk. So that's why
Ooh.
we're talking about it here. It is part of the Cardio IQ Quest test if you as an add-on test. So they actually look at it as part of that heart health panel. So if you see an elevation of that marker, you really want to get after that. And depending on how high it is, it might require taking high dose medical grade probiotics in addition to your diet, getting those fermented foods and also the prebiotic foods, which are the foods that the microbes like to eat, which is garlic and onions, and again, the oats and barley and things like that. So it's like the whole picture for our heart health is important. So if you are a person with high LDL cholesterol particles or lipoprotein A, you shouldn't be smoking. I mean, you have to really reduce the things in your life that are potentially promoting cardiovascular disease because you're already at high risk. And so smoking is one of the number one, things that leads to heart attacks. And so that would be one of the main things to focus on to stop smoking. Diabetes also affects vascular disease risk. And so if you happen to have diabetes and elevated lipoprotein A and you smoke, now we're really in trouble. And so you do want to look at all these factors as one thing and see what is modifiable in here. So even though you may have genetic risk for your LDL particles to be high or your lipoprotein A to be high, what are the things you can change with lifestyle and medication to get yourself out of that risk zone and find out not just your numbers, but as we talked about the heart scan, get that calcium scoring heart scan to see where you are. And we used to recommend it for 50 and over. Now it's like 40 and over. It's a good test to get because if that score on that scan comes out as 0, they have no plaque, that's really encouraging because that means you don't have any coronary artery disease. And that's really good to know. That means you're not really that high risk in spite of all those markers being off.
And we should say, and you've said this before, Dr. Cooper, that you can be thin and you could look like the picture of health and have a completely clogged up heart, right?
Oh, totally. Yes. We can't tell from the outside what's going on the inside at all. That's just really a myth. And so, regardless of your size, get tested. And one thing to keep in mind, though, is certain things, people will tell you if you have elevated lipoprotein A, LP little a lot of times doctors say, well, you don't ever have to measure it again because once it's elevated, it's always elevated since it's a genetic risk marker. But one thing to keep in mind is we actually do measure it frequently because we're also like looking at the data over time to see what might be influencing it. And it is interesting. You do see it fluctuate. It does fluctuate. And so usually if it's elevated, it's just going to be elevated forever. But there are times and certain things that cause it to go up acutely. And so you want to make sure that it's measured enough to make sure it wasn't a fluctuation. So for example, pregnancy, boy, don't look at your cholesterol panel if you're pregnant. Oh boy. I don't know what the purpose of that is from an evolutionary standpoint, but women's cholesterol profile gets so really off balance during pregnancy. It just skyrockets. The
Well, if
LDL.
you think about all the little cells that are being formed inside, and you talked
Yes.
about the importance of cholesterol in cell
Oh
formation,
yeah, maybe that's it.
maybe
But
that's it.
maybe it is, but the LDL goes up, the LDL particles, the lipoprotein A. So don't judge yourself during pregnancy.
Take a pass.
Yeah. And then if you have kidney disease, that can artificially elevate that. I mean, it's not artificial, but it can acutely elevate the lipoprotein A. And also, apparently, if you have hypothyroidism that's not under good control, you could have an elevated level. So if any of those are happening, just retest it when the conditions are different to find your baseline, basically. And one other thing that can raise it acutely is just inflammation. So if you were sick when it was measured, you had just had an immunization or fought a virus or something like that, viruses increase it for usually at least a few weeks after you're over the virus. So when it's being tested, just make sure that you're sure that's a baseline, and definitely test it again at some point just to confirm. But if you think that you want to see whether it's progressing and how high it's getting, sometimes that's helpful because it puts you into certain risk tiers. If it is increasing, then you might want to be more aggressive with the level of LDL that you want to achieve.
Well, this has been super interesting. Who knew?
Who knew the
Fats.
fat that lurks within?
Blood fats, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thanks, you two. This has been awesome. Super fun. And another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.